Welcome back. Now we've created an inventory, and in this video we're going to add one more feature to the inventory, and that's an animated icon that shows us which slot in the inventory a weapon will go if we pick it up. And so this animation will play if we're hovering over an item and we're just about ready to pick it up. So let's get started and create this animated icon. So we're going to go ahead and get our weapon slot widget blueprint. Let's go ahead and open that. Here we have the weapon slot widget, and we're going to take our overlay here and we're going to add a border to the overlay. So up here in the palette we have a border. We're going to stick that right here on the overlay. So we have this border now. We're going to call this highlight border. Now the highlight border can take a brush. So down here in appearance, click the drop down next to brush and we can select an image. And we're going to select inventory, select button 2. That's that white rectangle. Now here in appearance, we're going to set the draw as to be box. Now the border here in UMG is going to stretch our image using the border of the image texture. Now the margin is for how much we want on the edges. So I'm going to select 0.05, and that's going to give us a margin of 0.05 on the left, top, right, and bottom. Now we're going to set the horizontal and vertical alignment to fill. And now you can see if you scroll in, we have our border texture. Now if we were to resize our image, you'll see that the border is keeping its same thickness. And our margin has to do with where we're getting the edge. You see how we take the edge up to a certain amount. If we make our widget too skinny, you'll start to see where the margin is. If I change the margin here on the left to say 0.1, now you can see that it's taking more of the left edge. So we're going to keep 0.05. That'll work for our purposes, and I'm going to scale this right back to where it was. All right, so we have a border, and I'm going to take this all the way up to just under the overlay. That's going to put it behind everything. Now we can add an animation using this border. So let's go ahead and with our highlight border selected, we're going to add a new animation, and we're going to call this highlight animation. Now select highlight animation, check is variable in the details panel, and we're going to add an animation track for this. So here in the timeline, click plus track and select highlight border. And we're going to add an animation track for transform. Now click the drop down for transform. And let's open up our scale. And for the scale, set both X and Y to 1.25. And now we'll see that our border is 25% larger than the actual weapon slot. Now, thanks to this being a border, you'll see that our border edge is not warped or stretched. It keeps the same thickness. That's why we're using a border. Now, drag the timeline to 0.75 seconds. And here we're going to set the scale for X and Y to both be 1. And that'll bring our border back into the normal size. Now we can go ahead and press play and see that when we're playing our animation, it looks like our square is shrinking. Now we can see what this animation looks like when it's looping over and over again. To do that, set the animation to loop playback range by clicking on this icon here, and now it says loop playback range. Now press play and you'll see what it looks like when looping. Okay, so let's stop playing that. Let's go back to the beginning, to the 0 point in time. Now we're going to add another track. So let's close up this transform and let's create another track by pressing plus track. And for this one, we're going to choose render opacity. Here we don't have a drop down because render opacity is just a single value. Now with the timeline at 0, put the render opacity at 0.6. Drag to about 0.2 seconds and set the render opacity to 1. And now drag the timeline to about 0.7 and set the render opacity to 0. Let's see how this looks. We'll drag it back to 0 and press play. And now you'll see that it brightens up and then fades as it gets closer to normal size. And when I say normal size, I mean the size of the weapon slot. We can even click here in the graph so that we don't get that green box selection. And this will show us a little bit more of a representation of how it's going to look. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hit pause and bring this back to 0 on the timeline. Now I'd like to add a little arrow icon to this. So I'm going to go to our _game/assets/textures and go into the icons. Now we're going to import another texture. We're going to put this into button icons. Now you're going to need to have this textures folder downloaded from the GitHub page, so the link will be in the resources. But once you have that textures downloaded, then you'll be able to import this icon that we're going to import. We're going to click Add Import, Import Asset. We're going to find the textures folder containing those textures from the GitHub page. And we're going to go to Icons, Button Icons, and select Arrow Icon.tga. Click Open, and now we have this arrow icon. Go ahead and open it and set the compression settings to User Interface 2D and save. And we can close out of that. So now we have an arrow icon. Now we're going to add an image to our overlay. So go ahead and search for image and drag an image onto the overlay just under highlight border. And let's call this image arrow icon. Now we're going to set the brush to that arrow icon that we just imported. So it's called arrow icon. And we can see a little version of it there. Now let's go ahead and add a track on this animation for the arrow icon. So the track we have here is for highlight border. We can go ahead and close that up. And now select the arrow icon. And with the arrow icon image selected, click the green plus track and select arrow icon. Now we have arrow icon here, and we can click plus track here. Let's add a track for transform. And go ahead and click the drop down next to transform. And with our timeline at 0 seconds, let's open our translation and set the Y to -50. And you can see that the arrow is raised a bit. Now move the timeline to 0.75 and let's set the Y to -15. So now this arrow is going down as we play the animation. Next, set the timeline back to 0 and let's now add a track for render opacity for the arrow icon. So click plus track here and select render opacity. And let's have the render opacity start at 0.6. And we'll go up to about 0.25 seconds and increase the render opacity to 1. And then dragging all the way to 0.75 seconds, I'll put the render opacity to 0. So the render opacity starts at 0.6, increases to 1 at 0.25 seconds, and then fades away to 0 at 0.75 seconds. Now let's go back to 0 on the timeline, and for the arrow icon, let's take a look at the transform. I'm going to go ahead and close the drop down for translation, and I'm going to open the drop down for scale. Now I want to start at 0.6 on the X and Y at 0 seconds. So 0.6 for the X and 0.6 for the Y. Now I'm going to drag forward to 0.25 seconds, and I'm going to set the scale to 1 for the X and Y. So the arrow starts off small and it gets bigger at 0.25 seconds. And then I'm going to scroll forward to 0.75 seconds, and I'm going to put the scale at 0.8 for the X and 0.8 for the Y. So as the arrow fades out, it's also getting smaller. So if we want to see this better, we can take our weapon icon and click this eye icon here to toggle its visibility. We can do the same thing for background image, so that way we can't see those. And now if we press play, this is what our animation looks like. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and set those back to visible. So now we need code to trigger the animation. Now, since we will need to know which slot in the inventory is open, if any, we'll create a function for returning the inventory index for that slot. So let's go back into C++. Now here in shooterCharacter.h, I'm going to go down into our protected section and create a new function. I'm going to have this function return an int32, and I'm going to call this getEmptyInventorySlot. Let's create a function body for this. Now in getEmptyInventorySlot, we're going to loop through our array. So let's make a for loop, and let's say for int32, I is equal to 0, and we're going to loop as long as I is less than inventory.num, I++. We're going to check to see if inventory at I is null, is equal to null pointer. If it's null, then we're going to return that index, I. Now, if we never actually reach the inside of this if statement, then that means all of the inventory elements are not null. Now, if we reach the end of this for loop and we never actually get into this return I, then the inventory is full. And in that case, I'm going to simply return -1. So -1 will indicate that we don't have any empty spots in the inventory. So I'm going to give this a comment right here and say inventory is full. Now we may have less items in the inventory than the inventory capacity. For example, say inventory only has 3 elements in it and none of them are null. Well, then we're going to want to play the animation on one of the slots. So I'm going to add the following. I'm going to say if inventory.num is less than inventory capacity, then if we've reached this if statement, that means that we've looped through all of the elements in inventory and none of them were null, but we're still not filling the inventory capacity. So we're going to just return inventory.num. And that's going to give us the index for the next slot. So for example, if inventory has 3 elements in it and none of them are null, then returning inventory.num is going to return 3, and index 3 is the next free slot in the inventory. Okay, so now we have a function to get the empty inventory slot. We're going to go ahead and conclude the video here, and in the next video, we're going to set this up so that we can get the empty inventory slot and play that icon animation. We'll see you in the next video.